Okay, so today we're gonna dive into this fascinating situation unfolding in Nepal. It's been like, what, 16 years since they transitioned away from having a monarchy?
Yeah, 16 years since they officially abolished it.
Right, abolished it. But there are some pretty strong signs recently that not everyone's thrilled with how things have been going since then. In
Yeah.
fact, um,
Yeah, you could definitely say that.
yeah, there's a kind of a resurgence of support for the monarchy. And
Or more than a kind of, I'd say.
yeah, fair enough.
It's pretty significant when you consider that an estimated 10,000 people in Kathmandu turned out to welcome back the former King Gyanendra Shah. That's not just a small group voicing their opinions.
10,000. Wow. And what's interesting too is they're not just there for the nostalgia factor, right? These supporters are very clear about wanting to bring back the monarchy and also to reinstate Hinduism as the state religion. They even went so far as to block the main entrance to Kathmandu's international airport.
Yeah, that was a pretty bold statement. Chanting slogans and really disrupting things. You have to wonder what they hoping to achieve with that.
I mean, it definitely got attention, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And it forced the authorities to react. Hundreds of riot police were deployed to make sure things didn't escalate. Clearly, they were worried about the situation getting out of control.
It does seem like a volatile situation.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so for our listeners who may not be completely familiar with Nepal's recent history, can we take a quick step back and talk about who King Gyanendra is and how things got to this point?
Yeah, definitely. So to understand this current situation, we do kind of have to rewind a bit, right?
Right.
So King Gyanendra actually became king in 2002 after a really tragic event, the Royal Massacre.
Oh, yeah, right. The whole family was.
Yeah, it was a horrific event.
Yeah.
And at first, he was a constitutional monarch. So his power was limited by the Constitution. But then in 2005, he did something pretty dramatic. He basically seized absolute power.
Whoa, as she took over.
Pretty much, yeah. He disbanded parliament, jailed politicians and journalists, and declared a state of emergency. It was a period of direct rule. Essentially, he was in complete control.
But that didn't last too long, did it?
No, not at all. In 2006, massive protests broke out across the country. The pressure was immense. And ultimately, he had to relinquish that absolute authority. And then, a couple of years later, in 2008, the parliament took the final step and abolished the monarchy altogether.
Wow, so centuries of royal rule just came to an end. Just like that.
Well, not just like that. There was a lot of momentum building for this kind of change. And at the time, there was a lot of hope that this would lead to a more democratic and prosperous Nepal.
Yeah, you'd think getting rid of an authoritarian ruler would be a good thing for democracy, right?
You would certainly think so.
But here we are, just over 15 years later, and there's this pretty significant movement calling for the return of the monarchy. So our big question for today is why? Why this resurgence of support? What does it tell us about the state of affairs in Nepal?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it really underscores the point that political transitions are complex. They don't always unfold in a neat and predictable way. And sometimes the outcomes are unexpected.
Absolutely. So let's dig into that a little bit. Let's talk about this discontent that seems to be fueling this whole thing.
Sure. So I think a lot of it boils down to frustration with the way things have gone politically since 2008.
Like specifically what? What are people frustrated about?
Well, one big one is the lack of political stability.
Yeah.
Nepal's had 13 different governments since 2008.
13.
13.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I
Yeah.
think when you have that kind of constant turnover, it becomes really difficult to make any meaningful progress on the issues that matter to people.
Like, yeah, poverty, corruption, all the things Nepal's been struggling with for a long time.
Exactly. And so for some people, the idea of bringing back the king is less about some deep love for the monarchy and more about a desperate desire for some kind of change, for something different than what they've been experiencing. I mean, can you imagine living through 13 different governments in such a short span of time?
It's mind-boggling. I mean, look, I complain about our government sometimes, but I can't imagine going through that level of political upheaval.
It must be incredibly disorienting.
Mm.
And it really highlights how important a sense of continuity and stability can be for people.
For sure. And we see that reflected in some of the things people are saying. We have this quote from a supporter, Ther Bahadur Bandari, who's 72 years old. And he said, "We are here to give the king our full support and to rally behind him all the way to reinstating him in the royal throne." That's a powerful statement. Like he's fully committed to this idea of bringing back the king.
It is. And even more telling are the people who were actually involved in the protests to remove the king back in 2006, who are now saying they support the monarchy. Like there's this 50-year-old carpenter, Kulraj Shrestha, who was out there protesting back then, but now he says things like massive corruption and the feeling that the politicians aren't actually doing anything to help the country have made him change his mind. He actually said, "I was in the protests that took away monarchy hoping it would help the country, but I was mistaken, and the nation has further plunged, so I have changed my mind."
Wow.
Yeah, it really shows how disillusioned some people are. They were hopeful that getting rid of the monarchy would lead to positive change, but for them, it seems like things have actually gotten worse.
Yeah, so in a way, for some people, the monarchy represents a time that, even though it had its problems, at least felt more stable.
It's a complicated nostalgia, for sure. But when you consider that none of the 13 governments since 2008 have managed to complete a full term, and that you factor in the real consequences of that instability, like collapsing infrastructure, high unemployment, young people leaving the country to find work elsewhere, you can start to see why some might look back at the monarchy, even with its authoritarian past, and think maybe things weren't so bad then. I mean, would you rather have a system that's stable but undemocratic, or a system that's democratic but completely chaotic?
It's a tough question, and of course, it's not as simple as just choosing between those two extremes.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
But it does highlight the very real dilemma that some people in Nepal seem to be facing.
Yeah. And it seems like this whole issue of corruption is a huge part of it, too.
Oh, absolutely. Nepal ranks 110th on Transparency International's corruption index. That's really bad.
Yeah, it means corruption is a major problem. And when you look at some of the specific cases, it's pretty shocking.
It is. Like in 2022, there were reports that $500 million in COVID relief funds just vanished. $500 million. And as far as we know, no one has been prosecuted for that.
That's insane. And what about that government minister who was allegedly caught with $1 million in cash that he couldn't account for? And he's still in office.
I know, it's unbelievable. That kind of thing just completely undermines people's faith in the government.
It's no wonder people are frustrated.
Right. And then you have the fact that in the 2023 local elections, something like 70% of the candidates were facing criminal charges.
70%. Are you serious?
I am. It's hard to imagine a situation where democracy can really function when so many of the people seeking office are already accused of breaking the law.
It makes you wonder what message that sends to people about who they can trust. And it's kind of interesting how some people contrast this current political corruption with the corruption that they believe existed under the monarchy. Like some are saying that at least the king, if he was corrupt, was stealing for the crown, not just for his own personal gain. It's like they're saying the king's corruption was somehow less objectionable because it was for the benefit of the institution.
Right. It's this almost romantic notion that somehow the king was above the petty squabbles of politicians and was acting in the best interests of the nation. Even if he was enriching himself, it was for the greater good of Nepal, so to speak.
Wow. So what does all of this mean for the future? I mean, is the monarchy actually going to come back to Nepal?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Legally, it would require a two-thirds majority vote in parliament to reinstate the monarchy. And with the current political landscape, that seems pretty unlikely.
So even with all this support, it might not actually be possible?
Right. But I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about some technical legal process. This is about a fundamental shift in public sentiment. And that shift is real, regardless of whether it leads to a change in the form of government or not.
And it's especially noticeable among younger people, right? There was that survey in 2023 that showed support for a ceremonial monarchy among young people had tripled since 2018.
Yeah, exactly. It went from 12% to 32%, which suggests that for a lot of young Nepalese who didn't experience the monarchy firsthand, the idea of a king, even in a limited role, is actually becoming more appealing.
I guess it makes sense. If you grew up in a time of political chaos and corruption, the idea of a strong, stable figurehead might sound pretty good.
It's certainly understandable. But of course, it's important to acknowledge the other side of this. The critics who warn that romanticizing the monarchy ignores its history, a history that includes some pretty awful things, like the 2001 Palace massacre, the censorship, the suppression of dissent. Those things were real, and they can't just be brushed aside.
No, of course not. It's like anything else, right? We can't just look at the past through rose-colored glasses.
Exactly. But I think the quote from political analyst Rajesh Shah really gets at the heart of what this is all about. He said, "This isn't about the king. It's a scream for moral leadership. If politicians don't reform, Nepal may trade democracy for a strongman royal or otherwise."
It's not necessarily about a specific person or a specific system.
Right. It's about a desire for leadership that is perceived as honest, effective, and committed to the well-being of the country. And if the current political class can't provide that, then people will look for it elsewhere.
Wow. So where does that leave Nepal? What does the future hold?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Nepal is at a crossroads. On the one hand, you have this growing disillusionment with the current political system. On the other hand, you have this nostalgia for the stability and order, real or perceived, of the monarchy.
And both sides are fueled by very real concerns, right? Frustration with the lack of progress, the constant political instability, the pervasive corruption.
Exactly. And I think the big question is, can the current political leaders address these concerns? Can they convince the people that democracy can work, that it can deliver a better future for Nepal?
Or will this push for a return to the monarchy continue to gain momentum? Is this truly a desire to go back to the old system, or is it something more nuanced? Is it, as we've been discussing, a cry for effective leadership, regardless of what form it takes?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And unfortunately, I don't have the answers.
Yeah.
I think it's something that we all need to pay attention to. The situation in Nepal is evolving, and it's going to be fascinating and a little bit worrying to see how it all plays out.
It's definitely a story we'll continue to follow here on The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that's shaping